Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transformative. In the last two podcasts, we treated the short prophetic book of Obadiah. This week we will feature another short prophetic book, Nahum. This, as is the case with Obadiah, is not a well-known book. This is understandable in that the prophet takes aim at Nineveh, the capital city of Assyria. The Assyrian Empire was a notorious enemy of Israel. Indeed, it was the reason that the northern kingdom, known as Israel or Samaria, fell in the 8th century. Assyria was about to destroy Judah, the southern kingdom, as it rampaged all of Israel. However, circumstance did not allow Assyria to fulfill its mission. Judah survived, at least for a while. Eventually, Assyria itself was soundly defeated by empires that had been gaining strength, namely Media and Babylon. The prophecy of Nahum did not attribute this Assyrian defeat primarily to stronger countries. Instead, Nahum argued that Nineveh, which stood for the whole Assyrian Empire, was the victim of divine judgment. That judgment was attributed to the Israelite deity. Nahum is relentless in describing, often in lurid detail, the result of the avenging actions of Israel's God. The oracle begins by noting that the Lord is a jealous and avenging God, such that God's wrath is directed toward any enemies. That's in verse 1 of chapter 1. Of course, Israel's enemies and God's enemies are the same. Even though the Israelite God is slow to anger, this same deity will not let the guilty off the hook. That's in verse 2. Assyrian hostility toward God's elect people has put them in God's crosshairs. Just in case there is any doubt about the ability of this God to avenge, Nahum points to God's awesome power. The prophet does this by evoking the metaphor of weather. This deity is a whirlwind and a storm. Clouds are the dust of this God's feet. That's in verse 3. God has no difficulty in rebuking the sea, even making it dry. Rivers, too, are dried up by Israel's God. Vegetation in Bashan, Carmel, and Lebanon withers and fades. These places are known for verdant fields. That's in verse 4. Mountains quake when this God is present. Hills melt. The earth, the whole world, and everything that is in it. These entities are laid waste. That's in verse 5. Given this, what chance does Nineveh have? The question is rhetorical. At this point, the oracle segues into a section which asks, again rhetorically, who can stand up against this divine indignation or anger? That's in verse 6. This anger is comparable to fire, or a power that breaks rocks. Even though the Israelite God is good and a veritable stronghold when trouble looms, God knows who will take refuge in this divine fortress. That's verse 7. But that does not mean that God is an overflowing flood that will pursue enemies, that God is not an overflowing flood that will pursue enemies into darkness. One takes this divine goodness for granted to one's own peril. Anyone who plots against this deity will deal with a God who will rise up against any foe. That's in verse 9. Then, the Lord notes that regardless of the fact that there are many strong enemies, they will soon be neutralized. Indeed, though originally God orchestrated judgment against Israel, and used the Assyrians as the instrument of that judgment, the time for that affliction to end has come. Rather, the yoke that Nineveh put on Israel, as well as the bonds, will soon be broken. That's in verse 13 of chapter 1. Bondage will be over anon. Indeed, God moves against Nineveh will have the force of a divine command. The Assyrian name will be forgotten before long. The images of Assyrian gods will be eliminated, and vile Assyrians will have graves made for them by the Israelite God. Verse 14. At this juncture, the oracle turns and focuses on Judah. Peace will be proclaimed, and Judah will be encouraged to observe its religious feasts and fulfill its sacred vows. The wicked will no longer be a threat. They will soon disappear. That's in verse 15 of chapter 1 or verse 1 of chapter 2 in the Hebrew version. As well, Judah is to man the ramparts, watch the road, gird up the loins, and collect all their strength. That's in the English version, chapter 2, verse 1, verse 2 in the Hebrew version. It is as though Judah will become strong enough to withstand an Assyrian assault, or any other assault for that matter. In a sense, this is satirical because Nahum reflects a situation in which Israel had already succumbed to other hostile forces. It is no longer an empire. In fact, the next section is a highly charged passage that describes the sack of Nineveh. Though Nineveh's forces are arrayed in red and scarlet clothes, making it seem that their chariots, led by prancing horses, are on fire, even though these chariots rage in Nineveh's streets and dash through city squares, they are said to gleam like torches and dart like lightning. That's in verse 4 of chapter 2 of the English version. Though that sounds formidable, officers stumble as they are called to arms and rush to the defensive wall. When the river gates are opened, presumably by the encroaching army, the palace personnel are aghast. Women are carried off, moaning in anguish and beating their breasts in the process. That's in verse 7. Nineveh has become a pool, indicating a flood of some sort. Though panicked people yell for the waters to stop, these waters keep on coming. That's in verse 8. Then we are told what the attackers cry out as they enter the city. Plunder the silver and gold, since there is no limit of treasure. That's in verse 9. Nineveh is not only being destroyed, it is being plundered. Nineveh's citizens yell, "Desolate, desolation, and ruin." That is what one yells when stricken by faint hearts and trembling knees. All of a sudden, anguish is everywhere, and pale faces are visible. That's in verse 10. As this section concludes, lions, a term suggestive of Nineveh's army officers, are taunted. No lions' dens or caves for young lions are to be found. These lions no longer do what lions typically do, that is, act like apex predators. That's in verse 11. Lions used to get enough prey to feed their cubs and the lionesses. Now they have become toothless. That's in verse 12. The last verse of this chapter and the whole of the third and final chapter quotes God, so to speak, in a divine diatribe against Nineveh. The Lord announces that the deity is against Nineveh and plans to burn Nineveh's chariots, make sure that the sword of its enemies does its work. Sees to it that your young lions, a way of describing the military brass, also fall victim. Assyrian messengers will no longer have good messages to provide. That's in verse 13. This final oracle is relentless in its denunciation of Nineveh. It begins with a woe to the city, which is characterized by the blood it had exacted in its previous exploits, not to mention the booty that was extracted from victims. That's in verse 1 of chapter 3. The oracle describes these assaults with lurid descriptions of cracking whips, rumbling chariot wheels, galloping horses, bounding chariots, charging cavaliers, flashing swords, glittering spears, all of which resulted in heaps of corpses. Indeed, so many dead bodies strewn around that soldiers stumble over the newly deceased. That's in verses 2 and 3 of chapter 3. Then Nineveh is accused of deceptive diplomacy, in which it charmed other countries only to betray them later. This deceptive activity is referred to as whoring around. That's in verse 4. Because of this misuse of charms, consistent with the metaphor, the Lord plans to lift up Nineveh's skirts to shame their diplomats in the presence of those they have betrayed. That's in verse 5. Filth will be thrown at Nineveh with its skirts lifted up, so that they are treated with contempt and have people leer at them. That's in verse 6. People who see this sorry sight will say that no one will have an ounce of sympathy for Nineveh. That's in verse 7. At this point, the oracle turns to countries that had been allied with Nineveh, namely a country beside the Nile River, Ethiopia, Put, Libya, and of course Egypt itself. These countries are listed in verses 8 and 9 of chapter 3. All these countries were eventually carried away into captivity. Children were tragically killed. The most honored of their citizens left in chains. That's in verse 10. Like them, Nineveh will suffer the same fate. Again, this suggests a future action, but it is satirical in that this destruction had already happened. Nineveh, now compared to a drunk, will be dazed as it seeks help from the enemy. That's verse 11. Nineveh's fortresses are now compared to fig trees, whose low-hanging fruit is vulnerable to anyone who is hungry. All one has to do is shake the tree. That's in verse 12. Troops are insulted for fighting like women. Gates designed to protect the city are now wide open. That's in verse 13. Even as Nineveh prepares for the siege, as they fortify forts, there will be no escaping of the pending fire when the enemies breach the city. This is in verses 14 and 15. There is a flourish at the end of this devastating oracle. Assyria had increased its merchants like swarms of locusts or grasshoppers in a bid to enhance its economic efforts. Its policies also were compared to hordes of grasshoppers, and its scribes were likened to clouds of locusts, sitting on fences on a cold day, only to fly away when the sun rises. This may be a jibe against the empire's bureaucracy that, though huge in number, was ultimately feckless. It turns out that Assyria's shepherds, a common metaphor for kings or important officials, fell asleep when the king needed them. The same held true for nobles. That's in verse 18. In the end, there was no one who could prevent the scattering of the Assyrian people. In the final verse, Nahum points out that the hurt that Assyria is feeling will not be salved. The wound is too serious. Instead of pity, everyone who hears about what has happened to Nineveh and Assyria will applaud, a fitting response to a country whose unceasing evil had been a calling card. That's in verse 19. It is hardly a surprise that this book is not well known. This incredibly negative oracle about a country that does not even exist anymore is almost depressing. One can understand how Nahum would have cheered Israel when it was written. But what can one say about such a prophetic book for people who regard the Bible as God's word for today? Typically, a book like this is used to demonstrate the eventual downfall of any empire because of its hubris, and any empire that makes the lives of others miserable as it enhances its own political power and wealth. At the same time, Nahum is part of a canon. That is, a group of books which have been put together such that a new context for viewing them has come into existence. Nahum is not the only book that deals with Assyrians generally, or Nineveh particularly. For example, other prophetic books talk about divine judgment against the nations, including Assyria. At least as an analogy, the existence of empires is a reality that modern people have to deal with constantly. But there is another reference to Nineveh that needs to be mentioned. Another prophetic book, Jonah, also features Nineveh. In that little tale, every last member of the city, including the king and the cows, all repented, thus averting divine judgment from Israel's God. What does it say about that God? About that same deity who could be so totally against Nineveh in one book and couldn't save the entire city in another book? I think it says, at the very least, that judgment is never God's ultimate word. Divine judgment is a reality, to be sure, but judgment on God's part is always penultimate. Grace is just as surely God's final word. Let me encourage you to go to my website, my newly constructed website, and let me know what your email is so that I can contact you when the time is appropriate. And also, if you have a question you would like me to address in a Q&A section, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.